Shabbat Shalom, everyone. I wanted to share with you a few thoughts on Parshat Vayera. And particularly, I wanted to focus on the 6th chapter, verses 13 and 14. In verse 13, God commands Moshe and Aaron to speak to the Jewish people and to speak to Pharaoh with regards to the matter of the liberation, of the Exodus. And the question that people often ask is, why does God command Moshe and Aaron to speak to the Jewish people? Moshe's already spoken to the Jewish people. He's already explained that he was sent by God, what his mission is to liberate them. He's explained the skills he has and what's going to happen. Why does he have to continue to speak to the Jewish people at all? And if he has to speak to them, why does he have to speak to them first before he speaks to Pharaoh? Pharaoh is the one with all the power. That's who he needs to talk to immediately and directly. So one of the traditional answers offered, it's offered by a number of people, I've seen it in the Netziv, I've seen it also with Rav Kook, is that God needs Moshe to speak to the Jewish people, because it's not just Pharaoh who controls the ability for the Jewish people to be liberated. They themselves have to be convinced that they need liberation. They have to have the desire, and they have to be able to take practical steps towards that. And many of them just weren't prepared to do so. The double expression, right, that it was a yad chazakah, that God uses a strong hand and a zura nutiyah, and an outstretched arm. That one of those is for Pharaoh to sort of beat him on the head that he should let the Jewish people go. But the other one is also to reach out to the Jewish people and convince them that they need to overcome whatever is blocking them from wanting liberation and to move forward. And so the question I want to ask is, what was blocking them? What did Moshe feel they needed to be convinced by? So there are probably a lot of different possibilities to that question. I'm going to share with you quickly three. The first two involve shocking experiments. And when I say shocking, I mean literally shocking. The first one is an experiment performed by Martin Seligman, who's the, father of positive psychology at the University of Pennsylvania. In 1967, he did an experiment with dogs. And he took a few sets of dogs, particularly had these two sets of dogs, and he had both of them shocked, sort of painful shocks, electric shocks took place. In one set of the dogs, they had the ability to stop the shocks. They had a lever, and if they pulled the lever down, the shocks would stop. The other set of dogs had the lever, but when they pulled it down or played with it or did anything with it, it didn't stop the shocks at all. And fairly quickly, they learned that they had no control over their fate. They had no control to stop the pain that they were feeling. And as a result, they just gave up. The second stage of the experiment is they would put both of these sets of dogs in a room where the floor was electrified and would shock them. And there was, however, a way out. There was a barrier separating half of the room from the other half of the room. And the other half of the room did not have any of this electrified shocking taking place. And so there was really a easy, elegant solution to avoiding the pain of being shocked. All a dog had to do was jump over the barrier in the middle of the room and then go to the other side of the room. So those dogs that had, in a sense, been trained and let know that they can control the pain by having their lever stop the shocks they felt, they immediately, when they were shocked again, looked for a solution, looked to try to find a way to stop it. They jumped over the barrier. They realized they are not going to be shocked on the other side, and they stayed and remained there. The dogs that had sort of learned helplessness, that's the phrase that Martin Seligman introduces to psychological thought. They had developed learned helplessness, that they felt they had no control of what was taking place, and they just became conditioned to their situation. And so now that they're in this new situation, they didn't even try. They didn't run around. They didn't try to see what was on the other side. They didn't see if there was any other way to stop the pain. They simply acted passively, laid down, and whined until the pain stopped. In some sense, perhaps that's what was taking place with the Jewish people. They had learned helplessness. They had conditioned themselves to accept slavery that they were experiencing. And since they weren't able to control what was taking place to them for so many years, they didn't even give it a shot, even when the conditions changed, even when there was an opportunity now to be set free. And so part of the lesson that I take for ourselves today is that we should be open to the possibilities, right? That just because we couldn't do something yesterday doesn't mean the conditions haven't slightly changed today, that we might be able to do something differently. We have to be wary of growing in learned helplessness, of conditioning ourselves to accept the status quo. And each day we should try to overcome the status quo. And maybe tomorrow will be the day that will ultimately be successful. I should also point out there's a second message there as well. And that has to do with how we relate to people who have accepted their fate, who have developed learned helplessness and have become conditioned to their situation. One of the things that Martin Seligman points out is that the dogs who would not jump to the other side of the room could be taught, though, to change their behavior. Someone would come along and lift up their legs as if helping them to walk. And when they did that, eventually they did learn that they can take control of their lives. So we can help people overcome this if we join in partnership with them and show them the possibilities that have now become available. The second possible answer to what prevented the Jewish people from wanting to be set free also can be found in an experiment dealing with shocking, and suggests that perhaps they feared the freedom. And what exactly did they fear about the freedom? They feared the unknown nature of it. I remember reading a biography of John Brown. John Brown was, of course, at Harper's Ferry, tried to engage an entire slave revolt against slavery in the United States. And when you read the biography and you read the plan, it was going to be successful. Everything was going according to plan, and it was working. And then at the last moment, there were a number of slaves who he had recruited to be part of the plan who just backed out. And as a result, all the dominoes fell and the rest of the plan collapsed. And when these people spoke up, they explained that they just were too afraid of what might happen next. They knew what slavery was. And as bad as it was, at least they knew about it. They understood it. And they didn't know what freedom might entail. And therefore they were concerned and backed out of the actual thing. So this other experiment that I saw, so this appears in Dan Gilbert's book on stumbling on happiness. In it, he describes a group of people who had sort of anklet bracelets put around their legs, and they would receive 20 shocks. One set of the people received 20 high-intensity shocks, right? Time after time after time, 20 times, very high-intensity shocks. The other group of people received also 20 shocks, but they were mixed. 17 of the shocks were not high-intensity. They were low-intensity shocks. But mixed within the 20, there were 3 high-intensity shocks. Now, if you had a choice between which of those two groups you would be part of, I would think most people would pick the group that only has the 3 high-intensity shocks. But the data does not necessarily suggest that's what the people in the experiment themselves felt. How so? So those who only had 3 high-intensity shocks with the 17 low-intensity, actually had much worse physical response to their experiment. Their heart rate was much higher, their sweating was much worse, their degree of fear and apprehension of what was coming was much worse. Now, how does that make any sense? I mean, objectively, their situation is better, far better, 17 less shocks better than the other people who objectively are worse off. But subjectively, the people who had only 3 high-intensity shocks viewed their situation as worse. Why so? And they explained that they were fearful because they didn't know what was coming next, right? Out of that 20, sure, there were going to be mostly non-serious shocks, but there were going to be 3 that were really painful, and they couldn't anticipate what was coming next, and not knowing what was going to be the next shock actually caused a tremendous amount of stress and fear. And I think hidden in that experiment is this idea that we have a fear of the unknown. And here, too, I think there's a significant lesson for us, and that is to realize that we should not equate the unknown with bad. Very often the unknown might be positive. In this case, freedom is clearly much better than slavery. But very often we make the decision of the Jews who needed to be convinced to take a chance, to live a better life, to live a more rewarding life, to overcome their fear of the unknown and realize just because you don't know what's coming next doesn't mean it's a bad thing, and we should not hold ourselves back, but rather we should have the courage to experiment and try new things. The last possible suggestion that I'd like to offer today has nothing to do with shocks or things like that, but there is an interesting experiment that's connected. It's based upon the teaching of the Meshech Chochmah. The Meshech Chochmah actually looks at the verse right after the verse I started with. Right? Verse 13 speaks about God commanding Moshe and Aaron, speak to the Jewish people and speak to Pharaoh. The next verse speaks about the lineage, the genealogy of three families of the Jewish people, from the tribe of Levi, the tribe of Reuven, and the tribe of Shimon. And then it spends about 10 verses on this family lineage, on the genealogy, and then it returns to the story of the Exodus. And the Meshech Chochmah says, why in the world does the Torah interrupt the most compelling story of all time, the story of the Exodus, of liberation? Why interrupt it? God tells Moshe and Aaron, speak to the Jewish people, and then speak to Pharaoh. And then in 10 or 11 verses, it's going to start talking about the process of redemption. Why do we have this 10 verses in between that talks about genealogy? It seems totally strange, totally out of context, and not at all relevant. It seems not spiritually inspirational, and textually it seems out of place as well. So he says, maybe not. Maybe it's connected, and maybe it helps explain why, in fact, Moshe speaks to the Jewish people first rather than Pharaoh. It's not about convincing the Jewish people that they should not be fearful, that they should take a chance, that they should be ready for liberation. It's about preparing them for liberation and making sure it's a success. How so, says the Meshech Chochmah? So he points out, what's the connection between these three tribes? Shimon, Levi, and Reuven. And when he sort of does a database search, where do these three names appear together? What do they share in common? He notes that when the Am Yisrael eventually enters Eretz Yisrael, these three all have somewhat of an incomplete connection to the land of Israel, an incomplete inheritance. The tribe of Levi, we know, they don't inherit any land per se. They're connected to different cities, but they don't actually own their land, and there are specific reasons for that. The tribe of Shimon, we're told also, they were spread out throughout the land. Maybe there was a fear based upon Yaakov's concern that they would become too strong or too violent unless they were spread out and separated amongst the people. And the tribe of Reuven also. Right? The tribe of Reuven inherits on the other side of the Jordan. So yes, they inherit land, but it's outside of the traditional and essential borders of the land of Israel. And so each of them seem to have something lacking in their inheritance of the land of Israel. What can we learn from that? So the Meshech Chochmah says, well, I don't know too much about Reuven and Shimon, but I know about Levi. One of the reasons he suggests Levi did not acquire land in Israel in the same way the other tribes did is because we're told that the tribe of Levi was not enslaved their entire time in Egypt. There was a respect for priests, there was a respect for the family, whatever the case may have been, they were not enslaved at all during this time. And he suggests perhaps this is why they did not inherit land, that there has to be some form of suffering in order to acquire the land. If you want the reward, you have to sort of be a part of the process, right? You can't get Eretz Yisrael unless you also went through the struggling of Egyptian slavery. Maybe that's what explains why Levi did not get it. And then he goes on to say, and if we had one tribe that perhaps did not suffer in the same way and was not thrown together with the rest of their brothers, might it be possible that that's also what happened for some people in the tribe of Reuven and Shimon, to help explain why they also did not acquire land in the traditional way? And then he says it's a very short leap to suggest that maybe not only were these three tribes not fully enslaved like the rest of the tribes, maybe they were also enslavers. Is it possible after hundreds of years, if you lived a sort of an elevated status, a protected status, that maybe you might feel that you too have the right to enslave others, not only not to feel the pain of your brethren, but maybe even to be part of the process of inflicting it? Might that possibly take place? The Meshech Chochmah says, yeah, maybe that's what was taking place. And if so, then before Moshe can go to Pharaoh and insist that Pharaoh release the Jewish people, he first has to speak to the Jewish people. And he has to say, we better have our house in order. There better be no slave owners amongst us. If we're going to insist and demand moral behavior from someone else, we have to make sure that we have our full moral integrity first and foremost. And that's why you have the diversion and the digression of talking about the lineage of these three families right after The Torah tells us that Moshe was going to speak to the Jewish people and then to Pharaoh, and right before the continuation of the liberation takes place, because it can't take place until first we get our house totally in order. So there's a lot of things I think we can learn about that teaching of the Meshech Chochmah, the importance of being above board in all our behaviors, certainly if we want to try to encourage others to follow a certain behavioral path as well. I think there's also a personal element in this for all our families. I mentioned there's another experiment. One of my favorites is by the authors of Freakonomics, who point out that one of the surest ways to ensure academic excellence, or one of the clearest indicators of academic excellence amongst children, is the number of books found in the house in which they grow up in. What's interesting is they don't say that it's the number of books they read. It's not the number of children's books. It's not even the amount of time parents dedicate to reading to their children. These are all good and important things, but that's not the clearest indicator. What is the clearest indicator is the number of books that the parents read. In other words, if you grew up in a house and you saw your parents reading books and concerned about academics, so that seeps down to the child, that inspires the child, and it's a model that they emulate. And I think we can sort of extrapolate out this finding to many aspects of our lives, right? If we want our children to be scholars, if we want them to be more committed Jewishly, we want them to be more involved in the Jewish community, more dedicated to Israel, the clearest way of doing that is not just sending them to Jewish day schools or camps or Israel, but for us to do all those things, for them to see us running to communal events, for them to see us learning whenever we can. And it's not just, of course, in the Jewish world. It's in the expanded world as well. We want to convince our kids to be healthy. The best thing is not to tell them what they should do, but to do it ourselves, right? To have our house fully in order as a way of inspiring them with the proper model. And I would just add one more thing along those lines. We can apply this lesson to so many fields of our lives. But one of the things that, of course, is, I think, most problematic in today's world is the lack of civil discourse that exists in the public realm. Well, if we want to correct that, rather than sort of shouting that we should stop all this terrible talking about one another and blaming those who are involved in it, the best thing we can do is elevate our own civil discourse in our own lives, our own friends, our own social media. And once we do that, then we're really truly prepared for the liberation as Moshe would want us. Have a good Shabbos.